Barry, what seems to be the most obvious thing we can ask, what are ourselves, is really a very sophisticated question that has been dissected by philosophers, neuroscientists. How do you come at it?
Well, I think we've given up the idea that it was very popular and actually originates with Descartes, that the self is the conscious mind separated from the body, as if it could contemplate its own inner workings, its own experiences, its own thoughts, quite separate from being embodied in a world, from having a connection with an animal's substrate. Now, I think that's gone because our sense of self, whether there is a self, may be different from the question of what does our sense of self consist in. And famously, David Hume said, when you look for the self by introspection, you don't find it. You always come up with an idea, an image, an impression, an experience, a sensation. So he didn't find it. Maybe he was looking in the wrong place. Maybe the self is the functional organization of all those goings on. But it seems to me that the sense of self can be there whether there's a self or not, and that does persist. Now, the sense of self depends on sense of bodily awareness, bodily ownership, sense of ownership of one's limbs, a sense of agency in one's act. It also depends on memory. We realize that the self would really disintegrate were we not able to relate one episode in conscious experience to another. Very sadly, in the case of people with dementia and Alzheimer's, where there's a fragmentation and a breakdown of continuity of their mental life, they lose a sense of self. So the sense of self isn't something that's just present at a moment. It depends on continuities and things going on outside that moment that stream through it and sustain that feeling that it's me, that it's the same person over time. Now, I think, therefore, the idea of self is actually the idea of a number of collaborating and cooperating subsystems, like parts of an orchestra that have to be playing in unison to create this sense of self. And we think of it as unified, and we think of it as continuing, and we think of it as having been there in our past and going forward into our future. But unless all of those component parts were coordinating, were collaborating, the self would actually start to fragment. And I think that shows us the fragility of self-knowledge. The idea that we are a self is not something that we can take for granted. I think it's something we don't realize is very fragile.
Are you differentiating significantly between sense of self and self?
Yes, I think we could have a self and no sense of self. I think we could have a sense of self and no self.
Define each one.
Well, self might be some sort of ontological entity.
A soul.
A soul or something that persists over time.
Right.
And yet a sense of self can be lost or absent. It can be there. It can go on.
Because theoretically, you could have a soul, but then if the brain goes through dementia, you would lose the sense of self, even though you had a self.
Famously, some people will say, even when there's no memory and there's actually very little that marks the continuity between one moment of consciousness and another, people who believe in souls think the soul is still there. I would say there isn't much that counts as a self there once you get that degree of fragmentation. So for me, the sense of self creates whatever notion of self there is. But we could have a sense of self even if there is no single thing that endures right the way through. I mean, what would be this single continuity through all of our mental life? It'd be like a high-pitched noise that was always there, something that was always present.
So some pattern.
Yes, but the pattern's continually developing.
Sure.
It's changing. I'm sure you don't have the same patterns of mind you had when you were 5 years old or 25 years old, or you will have when you were
It's not the same patterns,
85.
but I have the same sense that it's my same self.
Well, notice you remember maybe being a 25-year-old, and the 25-year-old remembers being 5, but later on, the 85-year-old may remember the 25-year-old, but no further back. Now, that means that there was senses of self that took me only so far back. And as long as there's continuity in development, things are coming into view and going out of view. There's a moving wall of the self, really. Some things get lost as the memories disappear and others are gained. But I think the sense of self, as John Locke thought, might be as far as consciousness extends back in time. That's a large part to do with what we think the sense of self is.
So your sense of what the sense of self is that it would, in essence, create the concept of self as an illusion?
It might be an illusion. of course, it might match something that really is a self. I think we don't know, but there's also...
What would really be a self?
Well, this ontological presence of a continuing soul or something like that. But I really think...
You're agnostic about that?
I think I'm probably very skeptical about it rather than agnostic. But I wouldn't rule it out.
Okay. All right.
So here's what I think. We also have a view of ourselves that is constructed and which may be false. Sometimes we do things which other people will say are out of character. You say, that wasn't like me at all. Now, finding out you can behave in ways that were not like you suggests that we can surprise ourselves. And when we do that, that means we had a kind of pattern that was being established hitherto. And when we depart from that pattern, still me, but I think of it as not quite belonging in the class of things that I took to constitute myself.
How important is self or sense of self in our in us being human beings?
Oh, very important. I think when you see somebody who's reached a state of mental deterioration, fragmentation, where there's nothing that counts as being the same person they were several years ago, by then we think there's nobody there. And very often others will say, that's not the man I married, that's not my mother, that's not my husband. I mean, it's interesting that these days there's a lot of fiction in film about zombies, and zombies are people who seem to have just gone. We don't say he's now behaving like a zombie. We say he's gone. There's just this other thing, and I think that's where we think there's no self. And I think with cases of severe dementia, we're recognizing that more and more. The way in which the body outlives the mind, and there the self is gone. I think it's a very frightening prospect.